Growing up as a kid in the late 90s and early 2000s, the arcades was a place that I go often every weekend. Most of my gaming preference as an adult were heavily influenced from what I've played in the arcades. You got fighting games such as Tekken 3, Street Fighter Alpha 3, Marvel Super Heroes, and Virtua Fighter 2 to name a few. Then you got rail shooters such as Time Crisis 3, Virtua Cop 2, and The House of the Dead 2, which were some of my favorites. And last but not least, the main topic of today's video, classic 2D beat-em-up games. I started this channel playing a 2D beat-em-up game, Streets of Rage 4. My first discussion video was about how Streets of Rage Remake is a better game than Streets of Rage 4. It's a controversial opinion, I must say, but it was something that I was really passionate about when I decided to start this channel. As of today, that video is the best performing video for this channel. I would like to thank all of you who watched that video, whether you agree with it or not. This video is to celebrate the 3rd anniversary of this channel. As I said previously, 2D beat-em-up is one of my favorite game genres of all time. So what better way to celebrate the 3rd anniversary than to talk about the genre that started it all for this channel? In terms of game design, 2D beat-em-up games are very simplistic. You play a character, go over a linear stage from start to finish, beat up a lot of enemies on the way, fight a boss at the end of the stage, proceed to the next stage, and do it all over again. Although these games are the same design-wise, but different games usually provide different features to add more layers of depth. For example, some games provide a more in-depth combat where you can perform insane combos. Other games provide branching path storylines to enhance the replay value. Basically, there are a lot of things developers can add to enhance a fairly simplistic game. The 2D beat-em-up genre is also a reason why I really like the Musou-style hack-and-slash games. The passion I have for games such as the Sengoku Basara series were mainly because of my interest with classic 2D beat-em-up games. In terms of the format, Sengoku Basara is basically a classic beat-em-up game, but in 3D and some influence of Devil May Cry combat. As the title suggests, we are going to talk about my top 20 2D beat-em-up games. This is going to be heavily subjective since there are a lot of 2D beat-em-up games out there that I have not played. It's based on what I enjoyed the most. This is going to be the biggest video I have done so far on this channel, ladies and gentlemen. Without further ado, here are the top 20 2D beat-em-up games. Starting the list, we have a very underrated beat-em-up game for the Sega Genesis. There are multiple Mighty Morphin Power Rangers games back in the 90s, branching from different genres. One of the best Power Rangers games was Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie for the Sega Genesis. The game follows the traditional formula of a 2D side-scrolling beat-em-up game such as Streets of Rage and Final Fight. You pick one out of the 6 Power Rangers, battling your way to save Angel Grove from the evil Ivan Ooze. You can also play as the 4 different Zords depending on which level you are in. In total, the game has 6 stages where 4 of them has a Megazord boss fight. The Sega Genesis Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie game was developed by Sims and published by Banpresto in 1995. Sims also developed both Mighty Morphin Power Rangers games for the Sega Game Gear. Some of their most popular games are Shadow Dancer, Outrun 2019, and Tails Sky Patrol. The game also has a really good 16-bit Sega Genesis arrangement of the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers series soundtrack composed by Ron Wasserman. The arrangement was done by a former Sega music composer, Hashimoto Hikoshi. Some of his most popular works include Racing Hero, AB Cop, and Pat Riley Basketball. There are some flaws in this game. I wished all of the Rangers have completely different movesets. Everyone has the same attacks but different weapon finishes and charge attacks. I get that the Power Rangers have similar outfits with each other, but variety should still be a thing. This game has what I call the Dynasty Warriors clone problem long before Dynasty Warriors exists. Regardless, as a Power Rangers fan, this has always been the game that I come back to and also the game that I always wanted. The classic 2D beat-em-up style just fits so well with Power Rangers, and I still want to have more games for Power Rangers just like this. You pick a Ranger, fight enemies, have a Megazord boss battle at the end, and that's it. It wouldn't be a beat 'em up list without mentioning any Konami games. Back in the 90s, Konami and Capcom were like the kings of arcade games, no exception to beat 'em ups of course. Let's go back to a time when Konami used to make video games instead of a glorified gambling machine factory. Enter July 1991, introducing Vendetta, also known as Crime Fighter 2 in Japan. This is a sequel to the classic 1989 Konami arcade game, Crime Fighters. As the title of the game, the premise is self-explanatory. You play as a crime fighter, beating up criminals in a crime-infested city. The plot follows 4 heroes fighting their way in a criminal city called Dead End City in order to save a girl named Kate. You play as 4 different characters who heavily resemble early 90s action heroes. Blood, who resembles Wesley Snipes, Hawk, who resembles Hulk Hogan, Boomer, who resembles Jean-Claude Van Damme, and Sledge, who resembles Mr. T. Control-wise, the game is very simplistic. Instead of attack and jump like most beat-em-up games, you have punch and kick. You can also grab weapons in this game. One takeaway I have with this game is that the game is really short. You can beat the game in about 30 minutes as it only consists of 5 short stages. It's also unfortunate that this game never had a console port, though you can play this game using arcade emulators such as MAME. Even so, Vendetta is a really fun game that's worth trying. The game will give you the best 30-minute experience, especially in a 4-player co-op game. There have been more good movie-based video games than good video game-based movies. One of my favorite movie-based video games is another 90s Konami classic, Batman Returns for the Super Nintendo. Batman Returns for the Super Nintendo is a side-scrolling beat-em-up game based on the 1992 Tim Burton movie of the same name. The gameplay is very similar to that of Final Fight games where you have attack and jump. You can perform a cape sweep by pressing attack and jump together. You can even use Batman artilleries such as batarangs, grappling hooks, and also bat test tubes. One thing I really like about this game is environment interaction. You can grab a clown and slam him to the foreground wall. You can even grab 2 clowns and smack their heads to each other. It's always a good time to play Batman beating up clowns in Gotham City. There are 3 different sessions between 7 stages of the game. You have your basic side-scrolling beat-em-up session. You also have a 2D linear shoot-em-up session where Batman can only throw batarangs as an attack. You also have 1 stage where you drive the Batmobile. The game also has an amazing 16-bit SNES rearrangement of Danny Elfman's Batman Returns soundtracks. The music was rearranged by Funahashi Jun, who is most known to compose music for Yu-Gi-Oh! And Frogger games. For obvious reasons, the game doesn't have a co-op gameplay. However, I highly recommend playing this game to people who love classic beat-em-up games and also to people who love the Batman Returns movie. This is one of the best beat-em-up games for the Super Nintendo. It wouldn't be respectful for a top 20 list of beat-em-up games without mentioning Capcom's classic Final Fight. The first Final Fight game is considered as not only one of the best games in the genre, but also one of the fathers of arcade beat-em-up games. A little interesting fact about Final Fight. Originally, Capcom wanted this to be the sequel of the 1987 arcade fighting game, Street Fighter. Before we actually got Capcom's Street Fighter 2 in 1991, Final Fight was meant to be called Street Fighter 89, which was the year that the game was released. However, Capcom decided to switch genre in order to compete with the success of Taito's Double Dragon. You play as 3 characters in the game: Hagar, the mayor of Metro City, Cody, the street brawler, and Guy, the modern ninja. You are in a mission to rescue Mayor Hagar's daughter from the criminal organization called the Mad Gear Gang. You'll notice that most 80s arcade beat-em-up games followed the story of rescuing a girl from a criminal gang, whether it's Konami's Crime Fighters, Taito's Double Dragon, or Capcom's Final Fight. You can play up to 2 players in this game. This game has 2 action buttons, jump and attack. You can do special attacks by pressing jump and attack at the same time, at the cost of your health point. This game may be the first to apply this type of controls, which became the basic controls of most beat-em-up games that we got in the future. This game has 2 ports for the Super Nintendo. The first port is called Final Fight, released in 1990. You can only pick one of two characters, Hagar and Cody. The game also removed two-player mode, so you can only play solo. The second port is called Final Fight Guy, released in 1992. Instead of Hagar and Cody, you play as Hagar and Guy. The game also does not have a two-player mode. If you want to experience an instant classic beat-em-up game, I highly recommend playing the arcade version of Final Fight. Although the game is low on my list, but it still deserves all the respect in the world for bringing one of my all-time favorite video game genres. Since I mentioned Double Dragon in my previous entry, so a Double Dragon game is indeed on this list. Now, to be honest, I didn't grow up with a lot of Double Dragon games, and I wasn't too invested with the series. However, there was one Double Dragon game that I grew up playing and sometimes I go back to. The game is Double Dragon Advance for the Game Boy Advance. Released in 2003 by Atlas, Double Dragon Advance is a remake of the 1987 original arcade game by Taito, Double Dragon. Like the original, you play as the two martial arts brothers, Billy Lee and Jimmy Lee. Billy is the brown-haired guy wearing blue, and Jimmy is the blonde-haired guy wearing red. I always considered Billy and Jimmy to be the original Ryu and Ken. Before I talk about the gameplay, I want to show this amazing cover art for the game. The cover art is a homage to Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris from the 1972 movie Way of the Dragon, Billy being Bruce Lee and Jimmy being Chuck Norris. Control-wise, you have three action buttons. You can punch, you can kick, and you can jump. You can even perform different combos with different combinations of punches and kicks. You can also use weapons in this game. Some weapons actually have weapon combos instead of just smacking them on your enemy. This game also offers a really good co-op experience. It was a really amazing experience back in the day to play a beat-em-up game co-op on the Game Boy Advance. Not to mention, this game looks visually impressive for its console as well. If you want to experience a very underrated handheld beat-em-up game with an amazing co-op experience, then look no further than Double Dragon Advance. It wouldn't be a list of best beat-em-up game without mentioning TMNT Turtles in Time. This Konami arcade classic is adored by both TMNT and beat-em-up fans through the decades. This game has been a gold standard of beat-em-up games, and for a good reason. I mean, how can you not love a game where you can throw an enemy towards the screen? The arcade version of Turtles in Time came out in March 1991, based on the 80s Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles series. In this version, you play as 4 Ninja Turtles up to 4 players. Like most standard beat-em-up games, you have action buttons, jump, and attack. You fight through 8 different stages ranging from different time periods. This game has a Super Nintendo port that came out in 1992. The Super Nintendo version is called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4: Turtles in Time. This is the version that I played the most back in the day. Now, unlike the arcade version, this one can only play up to 2 players. However, Konami added more features to this version to compensate the absence of 4-player co-op. For start, this game has one extra stage called Technodrome Let's Kick Shell. The SNES version also has different color palettes for the turtles that you can select. The game also provides other modes such as Versus Mode and Time Trial Mode. It's a solid arcade to SNES port, in my opinion. In fact, I consider the SNES version to be the superior version. There is a lot I would like to say about Turtles in Time that wouldn't fit in this one video alone. It's a classic game that I highly recommend people to try it out regardless of what age you are. I would recommend the SNES version more than the arcade version. Either way, Turtles in Time will always be a timeless classic. I love a good Full Metal Madness robot action, so to speak. There's nothing more enjoyable than to watch giant robots beat the hell out of each other. Which is why this Capcom classic, Armored Warriors, is on the list. Armored Warriors, or in the cooler Japanese name, Powered Gear, Strategic Variant Armor Equipment, god damn it, that sounds cool, is a mecha-themed side-scrolling beat-em-up game by Capcom released in 1994. The game lets you play as 4 different robots: Bloodia, Reptos, Gul'dan, and 4D, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. What I find most interesting about this game is the in-battle customization system. During battle, you can actually switch multiple parts of your robot. These parts are dropped by enemies when you defeated them. Robot parts include arms, legs, and handheld weapons. Different parts can give you different types of power-ups. However, you are not completely invincible. Enemies can actually damage you to the point where you can actually lose your robot parts. Enemies can destroy your arm part, where later you must fight only with one arm. Handheld weapons are also limited with ammunitions. Personally, the ability to switch robot parts to gain different abilities made a fairly simplistic beat-em-up game a lot more in-depth. It's a fairly unique concept, and I admired Capcom for its creativity. One thing I don't like about this game, and it's a fairly minor one, for a game with 4 playable characters, you can only play up to 3 players. I wish the game has 4 players, but probably Capcom wasn't able to do so because of the sprites being too big. This game also has a fighting game spin-off called Cyberbots Full Metal Madness, and it's one of the most underrated 2D fighting games ever. A beat-em-up game with a good fighting game spin-off. How I wish Capcom could have done well for Final Fight. Overall, Armored Warriors is an excellent Capcom beat-em-up classic. I definitely recommend people to not miss this one. Before Marvel became mainstream with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I was a fan of Marvel back in the late 90s and early 2000s. My introduction to Marvel was in video game form, which was Capcom's Marvel Superheroes. Now, when it comes to the beat-em-up games, the first Marvel game for me was Konami's X-Men the Arcade game. X-Men the Arcade game came out in March 1992. This game was revolutionary at the time. Unlike most arcade games, let alone a beat-em-up game, this game allows you to play up to 6 players. Playing up to 6 players can be a really fun and chaotic game time with friends. Konami really know how to sell a game back in the day in order to compete with its competitors of the same genre. You play as 6 X-Men in this game: Cyclops, Colossus, Wolverine, Storm, Nightcrawler, and Dazzler. The objective of this game is to stop Magneto and his army from terrorizing human civilization on Earth. You will fight your way fighting enemies such as Sentinels and Lizards in spandex. You will also encounter recognizable X-Men villains as bosses like Pyro, Blob, Wendigo, Juggernaut, and Mystique. This game is also home to one of the greatest villain lines in history. The music in this game was done by a team. One of the team members was Takenouchi Yuji. He is well known to be the music composer of Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake and Mystic Warriors. He is also the sound designer for a lot of Souls games such as Demon Souls, Dark Souls, and Dark Souls 2. Takenouchi-san and his team really did a good job with the X-Men arcade game soundtrack. It really hits you hard even after 30 years. Unfortunately, just like most Konami arcade beat-em-up games, this game never actually had a console port during the 4th generation. It wasn't until 2010 where the game finally got console ports for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 by Backbone Entertainment. If you are a Marvel fan and want to play an absolute chaotic fun game with 5 different homies, X-Men the Arcade game is just the game for you. You might notice by now that I'm covering Konami and Capcom games back to back often. As I said previously, Konami and Capcom were like the kings of beat-em-up games back in the 90s. Most of the best classic beat-em-up games came from them. Now, how about a game that's named after Capcom itself? Introducing Captain Commando, a Capcom arcade beat-em-up released in 1991. The title of the game itself was named after the company that developed it. The Cap is for Captain and the Com is for Commando. Quite the interesting name if you ask me. The game takes place in a futuristic city where a group of 4 superheroes must fight crime. The 4 characters that you play are Captain Commando, Mac the Knife, Ginzu the Ninja, and Babyhead. Captain Commando was the first Capcom beat-em-up game that lets you play up to 4 players. The gameplay is similar to that of Final Fight, where you have an attack and jump button commands. You can press attack and jump together to perform a special attack that costs your HP. For an arcade game that came out in 1991, this game was quite brutal and graphic. Some of the characters that you play brutally murder your opponent. Ginzu the ninja can cut his enemies in half, and Mac the knife can melt his enemies into nothing but bones. I'm actually surprised that this didn't get as much attention back in the day in regards to violent video games, considering this came out before Mortal Kombat. Regardless, Captain Commando is a must-play instant classic. The game was the most successful arcade cabinet in Japan as of December 1991, beating Street Fighter II and WWF WrestleFest. With that achievement and being the first Capcom beat-em-up game with 4 players, the game is well deserving to be on the list. Anime-based games get a lot of flack amongst the mainstream gaming community, mainly because of the constant reliance of arena fighters since Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm series. While I do somewhat agree that some anime games are mediocre, calling all anime games bad because of arena fighters is a bit of a stretch. There are a lot of good anime-based games, like the one I'm talking right now, Gear Fighter Dendo for the PlayStation 1. Gear Fighter Dendo is a 2D side-scrolling beat-em-up game based on the anime series of the same name. Now let's talk about the anime for a bit before I talk about the game. The anime is about 2 schoolboys, Ginga and Hokuto, who are tasked to pilot a robot named Dendo to fight evil alien robots from outer space. The anime was created by Yatate Hajime, who is most famous for creating the beloved 90s classic Cowboy Bebop. For the PS1 game, Gear Fighter Dendo was developed by Natsume and published by Bandai in 2001. Considering it was developed by the same team, this game plays very similar to that of the Ninja Warriors for the SNES. In this game, you play as Dendo, fighting your way against enemy robots. You have a normal attack where you perform your strings. If you hold the attack button, you perform your gear attack. The gear attack can also act as a defense mechanism. However, your gear attack will deplete your battery the more time you use it. The game has 9 stages, and every end of a stage, you fight a boss. Once you defeat the boss, the game becomes a 3D fighting game where you go one-on-one against Night Gear Ogre. You will unlock a gear machine once you have beaten Ogre. The gear machines act as super attacks during the beat-em-up section of the game, while they act as weapons during your one-on-one against Ogre. Gear Fighter Dendo is one of the most underrated beat-em-up and anime-based games ever. It's a shame that this game was a Japanese exclusive for the PS1. However, with emulators that we have right now, I highly recommend anyone to play this game, especially if you're a fan of the Ninja Warriors. Now, this is a game that is often overlooked, and worse, downplayed by a lot of mainstream gamers. Final Fight 3 is the 3rd Final Fight game from Capcom released exclusively for the SNES. This game has a bad reputation amongst critics because it did too little in the way of expanding and improving upon the original Final Fight.
What?
So, doing minor improvements on a sequel from an already good predecessor is a bad thing? I don't think Final Fight 3 needed an extreme overhaul from the previous 2 games. In fact, having minor improvements from the previous 2 Final Fight games is a really good thing. Capcom took whatever worked from the previous games and made it better in this game. Also off topic, why are people so allergic with the number 3 in beat-em-up games? Both Final Fight 3 and Streets of Rage 3 got a lot of unfair hate in my opinion, honestly. We'll get to Streets of Rage a little bit later, by the way. Let's talk about the combat first. The gameplay is pretty much the same as the original Final Fight. However, this game applied some Street Fighter mechanics. You can perform some special attacks by pressing certain direction on the D-pad plus the attack button. You can also perform a super attack when your super bar is full. The input for the super attack is very similar to how you input them in Street Fighter games such as Street Fighter Alpha series. I do like this addition in Final Fight 3. However, I don't really like how they are implemented. When it comes to big super attacks in a beat-em-up game, you shouldn't have a fighting game-like inputs considering they are of different playing fields in terms of the combat. Super attacks should just be a one-button command. It's basically like the Basara attacks in Sengoku Basara. Luckily, future beat-em-up games have applied this mechanic such as TMNT Shredder's Revenge and Streets of Rage 4. One thing I do like about this game is the branching path gameplay. The game has 6 stages in total, with different pathways you can take along the way. The game will have different endings depend on the character that you pick and the path taken to reach the ending. You have 4 characters to play as. Hagar and Guy made a return from the first Final Fight. 2 new characters were introduced. Dean, who is an electromancer fighting to avenge the murder of his family, and Lucia, the hot badass cop with the deadly kicks. There's also an option to have CPU as a partner. Basically, you play 2 players, but the second player is a CPU. I do think it's a nice touch to have a CPU as a friend to play. Well, at least to some degree. Final Fight 3 is a solid beat-em-up game in my opinion. Though I admit that some features they add in the game were not implemented perfectly, but it doesn't take away the quality of the game itself. I still consider Final Fight 3 very highly among beat-em-up games. For that, I put this game on my number 10. I have covered an underrated beat-em-up game a year ago called The Ninja Warriors. I didn't grow up playing the game on the SNES, and only rather recently did I got into the game. The SNES game got a remake 25 years later after its release called The Ninja Saviors: Return of the Warriors. I find the game to be rather interesting because this is one of the few remakes of a classic 2D beat-em-up games that I know of. If you know a bit of the history of the game, this game is not only a remake of the Ninja Warriors for the SNES, but this is a remake of the original Ninja Warriors for the arcade. The game was developed by Natsume Atari and published by Inin Games in 2019. Natsume Atari, who was previously known as Natsume, developed the original SNES game along with so many classic SNES action games such as Mighty Morphin Power Rangers and Wild Guns. The music in this game was composed by one of my favorites and one of the most underrated video game composers, Iwatsuki Hiroyuki. He's the genius behind the music of classic Natsume games, including my number 11 entry, Gear Fighter Dendo for the PS1. The Ninja Saviors: Return of the Warriors plays very similar to the original with some additions. For start, all of the sprites and backgrounds have been redrawn and the field of view has been enlarged for a 16:9 aspect ratio. You play as 5 different robot ninjas, in which 2 of them are new characters for this remake. The 3 original robot ninjas are Kunoichi, the female android wearing a red ninja gear and 2 kunais as weapons, Ninja, yes, that's his name, who is the powerhouse robot wielding nunchuck, and Kamaitachi, the mantis-like robot assassin. 2 new characters for this game are Yaksha, the small android wearing a white gi with extendable arms, and Raiden, the giant samurai-like mech with the heavy arsenal. One of the best things about this remake is the addition of co-op. Unlike most 2D beat-em-up games on this list, when you play co-op in this game, you share 1 life bar together. Some might consider this as a negative, but I look at this as the game encourages players to work together as a team. This is very similar to that of Mortal Kombat Shaolin Monks, where you have a shared life bar for 2 players. All in all, The Ninja Saviors: Return of the Warriors is an excellent remake and an excellent game in general. The game also got a Steam release recently, and I highly recommend people to play it, especially if you are a fan of classic 2D beat-em-up games. Of all the games that are on this list, this is the only game that is not your typical arcade-style beat-em-up. Regardless, this game is still a 2D beat-em-up game. I consider this game to be one of the best anime games and one of the best Game Boy Advance games ever made. Dragon Ball Advanced Adventure is a side-scrolling beat-em-up game for the Game Boy Advance. Instead of an arcade-style beat-em-up, this game is more of an action platformer. The game was developed by DIMS in 2005. The game covers the story of the original Dragon Ball series from Goku's meeting with Bulma all the way until Goku's fight with King Piccolo. Like most beat-em-up games, you have jump and attack as your action commands. In this game, Goku can do two different special moves. If you press L on the GBA controller, Goku will perform a big helicopter spin with his power pole. If you press R on the GBA controller, Goku will perform a Kamehameha. You can hold the R button and enhance the Kamehameha. The longer you hold the R button, the stronger the Kamehameha will be. The game also has a tournament mode where you go one-on-one with an opponent. Although you don't have a lot of attack buttons to be a solid fighting game, but to my surprise and for what it is, the combat has a level of depth as a one-on-one fighting game, let alone just a side mode. The sprite works in this game was done fantastically. Personally, DIMS never fails when it comes to designing 2D sprites for anime characters. It was to be expected as well, considering DIMS as a studio was founded by SNK employers, including the two co-creators of Fatal Fury, Nishiyama Takashi and Matsumoto Hiroshi. Hiroshi-san worked as the lead planner and developer for this game. Dragon Ball Advanced Adventure is a game that I highly recommend. I sometimes consider this game as quite a sleeper, considering most of the popular Dragon Ball games are adapted from Dragon Ball Z. This is one of the few really good games adapted from the original Dragon Ball series, and it's definitely worth giving it a chance. The 2020s has been a decade of nostalgia and comebacks. We have so many remakes from the last 3 years and so many retro comebacks as well. Classic arcade beat-em-up games also had a resurgence since 2020 with the release of Streets of Rage 4 and many other more. Of all the games that are on this list, this entry is the newest release. Introducing Jitsu Squad, a Kickstarter project developed by Tanuki Creative Studio and published by Inin Games in 2022. The reason why I put this game in my top 10 is because I love what Jitsu Squad brings to the table. For start, Jitsu Squad, in my opinion, has one of the most in-depth combat mechanics in an arcade beat-em-up game. The combat is pretty much Devil May Cry in 2D form. There is a lot of crazy combos you can do in the game. I mean, look at the command list right here. This is very similar to that of Devil May Cry. You play as 4 characters in the game, each with their own unique moveset. Characters can also earn secondary weapons which act also as secondary movesets. Each character has 3 unique secondary weapons that you can change during combat. Therefore, everyone has 1 main moveset and 3 interchangeable secondary movesets. It's a nice addition and adds to the depth of the combat. The game also has guest characters that you can summon, such as Maximilian Dude and Ukulele. I do like the idea of having assist characters in a beat-em-up game. The music in this game was composed by Sebastian Romero. He took a lot of inspiration from the 90s, such as CPS2 arcade-style music and Saturday morning cartoon-style music. Some of the soundtracks that have vocals were sung by Crush 40's lead vocalist, Johnny Gioli, who is most famous for Sonic the Hedgehog music. Jitsu Squad is a good example of how classic arcade games can adapt in modern times. For that, it's well deserved to be on my top 10, and I recommend people to not skip this game. Imagine a beat-em-up game with the combat of fighting games and the character progression of RPGs. We have something like that back in the 90s, and it's called Guardian Heroes for the Sega Saturn. Guardian Heroes is considered to be a fighting RPG by its developers, Treasure. Released in 1996 as a Sega Saturn exclusive title, this game is a cult classic amongst the fans of the genre, and for good reasons. This game was able to apply the in-depth combat of fighting games for a beat-em-up game. One reason why the game was able to do this is because you move strictly in a 2D playing field. In most arcade beat-em-up games such as Final Fight, you move on a 3D playing field where you can move up and down. In Guardian Heroes, you have 3 2D playing fields where you can jump from one to the other. So having fighting game like super moves work better in this game than in something like Final Fight 3. The idea of having multiple 2D playing fields was actually taken from a Natsume game for the SNES, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie. As you progress to this game, you can unlock experience points to upgrade your character's stats such as strength, agility, and vitality. Not a lot of beat-em-up games at the time applied an RPG-like character progressions. The way it was handled in the game actually inspired modern 2D beat-em-up games such as Castle Crashers. The game also has an insane branching path storyline. Players of this game can choose where they will go and what they do after every level. Different paths can lead to different levels, bosses, and endings. Pause here if you want to see the story flowchart of Guardian Heroes. It is quite complex, honestly. You can also unlock characters in this game, ranging from enemies to bosses. The game honestly spoils players with a lot of content. All in all, Guardian Heroes is truly an amazing game of the genre. Had I played this growing up as a kid and given more time, I would probably put this game higher on the list. With that being said, it deserves all of the highest praise to be on my number 6. Hey, at least I don't put it too low, right, Oji-san? Are you really surprised that a Streets of Rage game makes it in the top 5? You guys already know by now that Streets of Rage is not only my all-time favorite beat-em-up series, but one of my all-time favorite video game series as well. I even said once in my older videos that the first Streets of Rage game was one of my first video games that I ever played. For my number 5 entry, I'm putting the gold standard of beat-em-up games amongst the community, Streets of Rage 2. This game is well deserved to receive the highest praise that it has. For its time, Streets of Rage 2 is not only the best looking beat-em-up game, but also the most in-depth in terms of the combat mechanics. Sega wanted to make Streets of Rage 2 a bigger and better sequel than the first game. In order to realize this at the time, Sega actually went all the way to improve the specifications of the Sega Mega Drive cartridge. So not only did Streets of Rage 2 improve the series, but it also improved the Sega Mega Drive or Sega Genesis as a console. You have 4 characters to choose from: Axel, Blaze, Skate, and Max. Each character has their own uniqueness in terms of stats and movesets. The game plays like a typical beat-em-up where you have 3 main commands: jump, attack, and special. You can also perform a blitz attack by double pressing the forward button and attack. This can make for some really cool combos. Streets of Rage 2 being one of the best beat-em-up games of all time is honestly self-explanatory. I understand completely why people regard this game very highly in this genre. However, you might be surprised in my next entry of the list. I said it before that somehow people are allergic with the number 3 in beat-em-up games. However, I often considered the third entry as the best of the trilogy. This is no exception to my number 4 entry, Streets of Rage 3. I've made a video 2 years ago where I ranked the Streets of Rage games and I put Streets of Rage 3 above Streets of Rage 2. My stance has not changed as of today. I still believe that Streets of Rage 3, or at the very least, the Japanese version of the game, Bare Knuckle 3, is a better game than Streets of Rage 2. Streets of Rage 3 enhanced the combat of an already good one from Streets of Rage 2. For start, I really like the fact that this game introduced running and side-scrolling. The small addition of running and side-scrolling really enhanced the game for me. A lot of times in Streets of Rage 2, running could have been very useful. Another improvement in Streets of Rage 3 is the star system. On the side of your health bar, you have the stars. If you earn a star, you can enhance the blitz or dash attack of your character. You can collect up to 3 stars. The more stars you earned, the better the dash attack you'll receive. The game also has a dash attack with weapons, which also can be enhanced with the number of stars you collect. The game also has a branching path storyline that no other Streets of Rage game has. You have 3 different endings. You unlock different endings depending on whether you rescue the general in stage 6. I do like this addition because personally, this enhanced the replay value of a game to a certain degree. One of the few downsides of Streets of Rage 3, in my opinion, is the music. Although the music is quite underwhelming for Koshiro Yuzo standards, but I don't think it's that bad. the somewhat underwhelming music doesn't ruin the game overall. In fact, if I'm being honest, I think the music in this game actually fits well with the darker tone of Streets of Rage 3. I can go over more on why I think Streets of Rage 3 is an amazing game, but this video is already too long as it is. If you want to get into Streets of Rage 3, I will recommend you to play the Japanese version a lot more, Bare Knuckle 3. If you are a fan of beat-em-up games and Streets of Rage as a series, I will recommend you all to please give this game another chance. There are a lot of good aspects of the game that shouldn't be overlooked. There are some games where no matter how many times I play it, I will always come back to and never get bored of it. It comes down to two certain factors for me. The game itself is really good from a quality standpoint, and my personal bias towards the game. What game am I talking about here? I'm talking about Panzer Bandit for the PS1. Panzer Bandit is a side-scrolling beat-em-up game developed by Phil and Cafe and published by Banpresto in 1997. The game felt like a spiritual successor and PlayStation's answer to the Sega Saturn's Guardian Heroes. If you are familiar with Guardian Heroes, then you are good to go with Panzer Bandit. The combat system in this game is more or less the same with Guardian Heroes. The difference is that this game has only two 2D playing fields instead of 3. There is an interesting history in regards to the development of Panzer Bandit. The developer studio, Phil and Cafe, was founded by former employers of Treasure. Panzer Bandit was indeed inspired by Guardian Heroes, but there's more to that. Guardian Heroes was actually inspired by Matt Stalker, Full Metal 4th, a game developed by Phil and Cafe in 1994. In short, Panzer Bandit was inspired by a game that was inspired by another game of the same developer of Panzer Bandit. Now, I will admit that objectively speaking, Guardian Heroes has more advantages than Panzer Bandit. Compared to the former, the latter has less to offer in terms of content and presentation. Panzer Bandit doesn't have a branching path storyline. This game also removed the RPG-like mechanics of Guardian Heroes and went for a more classic arcade-style approach. The reason why I put Panzer Bandit so high on this list is mostly subjective. I personally believe the combat in Panzer Bandit is a bit more in-depth than Guardian Heroes. Not to mention, it's one of the 4 beat-em-up games that I spent the most hours into. Another reason why I like Panzer Bandit more than Guardian Heroes is that I like the music better. I can't get enough of Panzer Bandit's amazing soundtracks. There are more I would love to say about Panzer Bandit, but couldn't fit in this video. In conclusion, Panzer Bandit is an excellent beat-em-up game and a very underrated one. If you like Guardian Heroes, I would definitely and strongly recommend this one to you. I said it before that we have seen a resurgence of arcade beat-em-up games in the 2020s. If you have been following my channel, then you know how much I love playing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge. There is no doubt in my mind that I'm putting this game in my number 2 list. This game has everything that I wanted in an excellent beat-em-up game. It has a solid high-paced combat, a modernized retro-style visual, a 6-player co-op, and, of course, banger soundtracks. I cannot stop playing this game because of how amazing it is. The game was developed by Tribute Games and published by .emu in 2022. There's an interesting development story for this game. With the success of .emu's Streets of Rage 4 game, Nickelodeon actually approached them in hopes of making a retro-style game with one of their IPs. .emu agreed to the project with Nickelodeon, but they wanted to act as a publisher for this. Instead, .emu handed the development project to Tribute Games, who were most famous to develop Scott Pilgrim vs. the World in 2010. According to Tribute Games CEO Jean-Francois Major, Nickelodeon had other IP in mind instead of TMNT. However, Major pitched the idea to create a TMNT retro-style beat-em-up game based off the 80s TMNT series. Considering how beloved the classic arcade game TMNT Turtles in Time is, Major felt like it was the right time to bring back something similar to that, especially with how successful the comeback of Streets of Rage was. Nickelodeon agreed to it, thus TMNT Shredder's Revenge became a reality. I like to call this game a 2D Musou game, mainly because how similar the gameplay mechanics are. You have the normal attack with square button, you have the charge attack by holding the square button, and you have a super attack with the triangle button. To do the super attack, you need to fill in the super meter on the right side of your health bar. The music was done by T. Lopez, who is most famous for his work in Sonic Mania. The game soundtracks are really good, to the point where I often listen to them while I'm working at my job for background noises to keep me company. The game became a commercial success, selling 1 million copies in just 1 week of the game's release. With the outstanding achievement and quality of the game, TMNT Shredder's Revenge is definitely a deserved runner-up for this list. I just cannot get enough of Streets of Rage 4. This is, without any doubt, the best Streets of Rage game in the quadrilogy. I have spent more than 200 hours in this game. It is just insanely good. Streets of Rage 4 is a 2D beat-em-up game developed by 3 developers, Dotemu, Lizardcube, and Guard Crush Games, released in 2020. The game is a sequel to Streets of Rage 3 that came out 26 years prior. Now originally, Dotemu wanted to make a remake of Streets of Rage, but decided to go with a sequel instead. Streets of Rage 4 is probably one of the prettiest looking 2D beat-em-up games I have played. Characters' animation looks very smooth. The characters' design and animation were mainly done by Lizardcube. Each playable character in this game has approximately 1000 frames of animation, while enemies have about 300 to 500 frames each. The amount of effort put in this game is impressive. The game also reworked the combat from the previous original trilogy of Streets of Rage. The game has a new combo system where you can juggle your enemies. The more combos you perform, the higher your score as well. There are a lot of players that have performed and showcased insane combos you can do in this game. The game also introduced the Star Ultimate move. You can perform this based on the number of stars that you have. The game also brought back all of the characters from previous Streets of Rage games. This game was definitely a big love letter to the Streets of Rage series. The game is also the first Streets of Rage game to have a 4-player co-op. I'm really glad that Streets of Rage finally has a 4-player co-op. Unfortunately, you cannot play online with 4 players since the game only allows 2 players online. It doesn't diminish the game whatsoever, honestly. The music was done primarily by a French composer, Olivier de Rivière, who is most famous for his works in horror games such as Alone in the Dark and Obscure. The game also features additional music compositions from other great composers in the gaming industry such as Koshiro Yuzo, T. Lopez, Fujita Harumi, and Shimamura Yoko. Streets of Rage 4 is a fantastic beat-em-up game. The game was able to sell over 2.5 million copies worldwide as of April 2021. The game is proof that the arcade beat-em-up genre can adapt perfectly with the modern world of video games. For that, Streets of Rage 4 is truly deserving to be in the number 1. There you go, ladies and gentlemen, my top 20 2D beat-em-up games. This has been a long list of... Here comes a new challenger! I have covered this game 3 times already in this channel, to the point where I don't need to explain too much on why I really love Streets of Rage Remake. This game is not only the definitive Streets of Rage game, but to me, this is the best beat-em-up game ever made. First of all, I am fully aware that this is not an official game. Some people have told me that it's not fair to compare or even put a fan-made game in a top 10 list of games. I completely understand that, but you know what? This is my channel and this is my list. If I want to put a fan-made game here, I'm putting it here. That's why Streets of Rage Remake is at number 0. I'm not going to repeat too much on why I think Streets of Rage Remake is an amazing fan-made game. If you want to see more of my coverage of Streets of Rage Remake, watch these 3 videos I have made. Links to these videos are in the description below. I'll make it short and simple here. Streets of Rage Remake was able to combine all of the good aspects of the original Streets of Rage trilogy. The combat system works very similar to that of Streets of Rage 3, with the addition of police backup from the first Streets of Rage game. This game also has every versions of the Streets of Rage characters, just like in Streets of Rage 4. The main difference, Bomber Games, the developer of this game, actually reworked all of the characters from Streets of Rage 1 and Streets of Rage 2 to have the combat mechanics of Streets of Rage 3. The character sprites were redesigned to make them consistent with the game's visuals. Not only that, a lot of positive aspects of beat-em-up games that I mentioned in this list are present in Streets of Rage Remake. From branching path storylines to customizations, this game has it all. For a fan-made game, Streets of Rage Remake really spoils you with a lot of replay value. Despite not being an official game, I strongly urge everyone to not overlook this game. I suggest you play the game yourself since it's a free game as well. You can download the game from the link in the description below. My stance in regards to Streets of Rage Remake has not changed until this day. To me, this is still the best Streets of Rage game and the best 2D beat 'em up game. So, that's it ladies and gentlemen, my top 20 2D beat 'em up games. This video took a while to make and it is by far the longest video I have made on this channel. This has been a passion project that I wanted to do for some time now. I've been making content on YouTube for 3 years now and it has been quite the amazing journey. For the last 3 years, I was able to meet a lot of new people in multiple communities and I also had the opportunity to create a community of my own. Unlike some other smaller content creators in this platform, the growth of this channel is rather slow. I haven't even reached the 1,000 subscribers milestone even after 3 years. But regardless of how the channel is growing, the channel grows still. I intend to go on this journey no matter how slow or fast it is, and I have all of you lovely people to thank for that. So that's it for my 3rd anniversary special. What do you guys think? What is your list of best beat 'em up games? Let me know in the comment section below. With that being said, this is me, Profar. Thank you so much for 3 years and I'm looking forward for all the years to come. Don't forget to subscribe and I'll see you guys in the next video.